Hi everyone and welcome to Tales of Dread. There are many highways and roads that people think are haunted by the spirits of people who used them in the past. One of the most shocking and well-known examples of this can be seen on a quiet stretch of road that goes through one of England's most beautiful national parks. This week, we look into the scary story of the hairy Hands of Dartmoor as he sat and listened to the coroner's opening statement. The police officer had tried to think about the case at hand. Since the accident happened a few months ago, he was having trouble remembering what happened because he had been to so many other events since then. He was very aware that his uniform was getting a lot of attention from the people sitting around him in court. In addition to the families of the victims, several members of the local government and a large number of journalists were there. As he cursed his bad appearance for being the officer who went to the scene, he nervously wiped his hands down the sides of his pants again. The coroner kept reading the statements of the people who had been at the scene, like the ambulance workers, who did not feel the need to come to the inquest, the doctor who did the autopsy on the male party, and the nurses who cared for the woman who was with him and lived. All of their written stories were told in a calm and collected way. The facts were agreed upon and thought to be safe from scrutiny. Finally, the coroner put down the stack of papers he had been reading from and asked for the constable by name. The officer stood up before swearing on a Bible that the clerk had given him, and then he introduced himself to the court. The coroner then walked him through his statement, stopping now and then to ask him to explain something or give more information. The officer said that he had been called to a part of the road called the B312, which was near Cherrybrook Bridge. There had been a car accident with a motorcycle and a sidecar, and the people in the motorcycle and sidecar were badly hurt. He said that the male rider had been taken to the hospital in Tavistock, where he died from serious head injuries, but that his girlfriend, who had been thrown away by the crash, had been saved by the same doctors. He was asked to make sure that no other vehicles were involved and that there was no evidence that alcohol played a role from witnesses at the scene. It seemed like the rider had lost control even though he was going in a straight line and there was nothing in his way that could have caused him to swerve. A local mechanic later looked at the twisted remains of the rider's motorcycle and found no problems with it. There was a pause, and then one of the reporters raised his hand. Does the officer know the story of the hairy hands? And did anyone know if this local story had anything to do with the fatal crash? There was a longer pause while the young officer carefully thought about his answer. He knew that everyone in the courtroom was now looking at him. He finally said that he couldn't think of a reason for the crash, and that he thought the real reason had probably been lost. Now that the rider's life was no longer in danger, he ran straight for the court doors to avoid everyone's eyes. He knew about the ghostly hands that were said to haunt the road between Potts Bridge and Two Bridges, but he wasn't sure what the injured driver had been saying as he was put in the back of the ambulance at the scene. He also didn't want to ruin his whole career by telling the reporter that the dying man might have been telling the truth when he said that an invisible person had taken control of his car. The first rumors that something bad was going on with the B3212 date back to the turn of the 20th century. In the early 1900s, several cyclists who were riding along this stretch of road said that an invisible force had grabbed hold of their handlebars and turned them sharply, causing them to fall off their bikes and get hurt badly. In some cases, it was natural that the local police didn't like these explanations, but as time went on, these reports kept coming. In the middle of the 1910s, a number of ponies in traps were forced off the same road. The drivers again said that they had felt a pair of rough, hairy hands on top of their own before the reins they were holding were pulled to the side. After that, several car accidents happened, and one person was found dead in the driver's seat of his car, which had turned over when it went off the main road. After two scary things happened on the road in the summer of 1921, the story of the hairy-handed ghost of Dartmoor finally took hold in the minds of people all over the country. The first one happened in June of that year and involved Dr. Helby, who was the medical officer at the nearby Dartmoor prison. Helby had agreed to take the daughters of the prison's governor for a ride in his motorcycle and sidecar. The two little girls in the sidecar screamed and cheered with joy as the bike sped down the road, until all of a sudden the doctor found it hard to keep control. He had tried for a few seconds without success to straighten the handlebars before the motorcycle jumped off the road and into a ditch. The force of the crash killed the doctor, but both girls were okay. When the police talked to them a few days later, they said that right before the crash, Helby had yelled at them to jump and said that someone had grabbed his hands and was trying to crash the motorbike. Even though neither of them had seen anyone else there, they were both sure that their driver was fighting with someone or something. In August of the next year, there was another accident involving a motorcycle. This time, it was a young army captain who called the police. This time, the rider made it through, and he swore to the police that he felt a pair of big, rough hands close over his own, and then those hands violently pulled his handlebars to one side. A few years later, in 1920, a woman and her husband who were on vacation near Powder Mills said that they had seen the haunted hands. The woman in the group said that something scratching against the outside of the caravan woke her up in the middle of the night. They were camping in, and she was getting out of bed. She had followed the sound from the door frame all the way around the outside of the caravan until it reached one of the windows. All of a sudden, a big man's hand appeared on the window. The woman was scared as it climbed up the window and tried to get in through the top, which was open just a little bit. She screamed an alarm and made the sign of the cross as her confused husband jumped out of bed after hearing her scream. The hand vanished right away, leaving no sign that it had ever been there. Almost 40 years went by before a similar case was reported to the police. Then, a scared driver named Florence Warwick stumbled into a local police station in floods of tears. She told the officers that she had pulled over to the side of the road to check her map because she had gotten lost while visiting family in the area. Warwick told the officers that she had turned off her car's engine and used a small flashlight to look at the route. She was startled by a dull thump coming from the windshield, so she turned the flashlight up to see what was making the noise. She jumped back in horror when she saw two large, hairy hands pressed flat against the window. Once the officers had calmed down the upset driver, they drove her back to the scene and searched the lay-by where she had stopped, but they didn't find anything important. Once they were sure she wasn't drunk or having a mental breakdown, they walked her back to the campsite where she was staying and told her to get a good night's sleep. There is still a lot of talk about who the owner of the spectral hands might be. Maybe. Some historians and locals say that they could be the hands of a driver who died in a terrible accident on the road and lost both of his hands. Others say that they belong to the ghost of a prisoner who was put to death at Dartmoor prison, and now wants to get revenge on the souls of the living. The story of an unnamed worker at the nearby Powder Mills, on the other hand, is what most people want to talk about. In this story, the man was able to leave his job at the gunpowder factory because he inherited money from a rich aunt who had died. He and his family celebrated for a long time at a nearby pub. The worker then decided he wanted to get his own tools back from his old boss and stumbled into the factory. The drunk man forgot that the owners of the company had given him safety boots, but he was wearing his own hobnail shoes instead. When his shoes touched the granite floor, they caused a spark, which set off some of the nearby powder and caused a huge explosion right away. After the fires were put out, all that was left of the victim were his severed hands on the cold, stone floor. Documentary evidence found in local newspapers shows that the gunpowder factory had its fair share of bad luck before it closed. In 1851 and 1857, workers died there because of explosions or fires that were caused by accidents that were very bad. Even though neither of them mentions the parts that were found to be missing. Who knows, maybe the hands don't even belong to people. Alongside these news stories is an article by a writer named Beatrice Chase. In it, she gives an alternative explanation for the high number of traffic accidents that have happened on the road. She says that the moorland, which the carriageway was cut through, contained a lot of metal deposits that made the cars move in a magnetic way. There is no proof that the local authorities have taken Chase's theory seriously or looked into it to any significant degree. Official police reports of accidents that have happened on the B31 say that drivers were tired, drunk, or didn't know the roads they were on. Work has also been done to reduce the camber of the carriageway in some places because it was thought that it contributed to the accidents. This story from the wilds of Dartmoor has a lot in common with other haunted highway tales from all over the world. We have already looked into the case of the ghostly hitchhiker who is thought to have annoyed drivers near Uniondale, South Africa. Another example is the woman in white who sits on the seats of passing cars and asks for a ride, even though she is drenched from drowning in a nearby lake. The hairy hands of Dartmoor are not the only example of a pair of ghostly limbs that have been separated from their body. In the Mexican city of San Luis Potosí, 2 sets of severed hands are said to haunt an alley in the Alfalfa district. These hands are thought to belong to 2 boys who were executed in 1780 for killing a priest closer to home. People have thought that a photo taken in Northern Ireland in the early 1900s might show a ghostly hand with its fingers cut off. In the picture of 15 women posing at a linen factory, it looks like one of the women has her hand on her shoulder, even though they all had their arms folded at the time the picture was taken. Unfortunately, the legend of the hairy hands has become something of a go-to for drivers who have been in traffic accidents in the area. In many of these cases, investigators have found more obvious and plausible explanations, which has made the stories about hairy hands from the counties long ago past less credible and important. We may never know if this scary story from the southwest of England is true or if it is just a lie made up by drivers to justify bad driving. Even so, if you are driving through the rolling moors and heaths lanes of Dartmoor, you might want to think twice about taking the B3 to 12. We don't need to be taught or kept in line,